And it is over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. So hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Liz from the Australian National University. And just to reiterate for our Q&A, feel free to raise your hands or post a question in the chat, however you feel comfortable. And so given the nature of the 5 talks we've got in the next 2 hours, I'd like to first introduce our first speaker, Shun Song, a PhD student from Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Over to you, Shun. We can't hear you. Maybe unmute.
Oh,
wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so hello everyone. I'm Song Jun from Nanyang Technological University, and today I'll be presenting our paper, Understanding Credibility of Adversarial Examples Against Smart Grid, case study for voltage stability assessment. This work is collaborated with Professor Tan Rui, Ren Chao, and Professor Xu Yan. Nowadays, the traditional power grids are evolving into smart grids to deal with the new challenges caused by the deployment of renewable energy, distributed generation, demand response, and so on. Deep learning technologies are increasingly adopted for enhancing various smart grid capabilities, including stability assessment, load forecasting, and fault detection. Although deep learning shows appealing efficiency in learning the sophisticated patterns from the big data generated by the power grids, these deep models are also vulnerable to adversarial examples. Adversarial examples are crafted inputs that aims to mislead the target deep models to give wrong predictions by adding very small perturbation to the clean inputs. This paper, for example, studies the adversarial example attack against the load forecasting model. Since power grid is a safety-critical system, wrong outputs of the DNNs used in the power grid applications may lead to catastrophic consequences. Therefore, the vulnerability of DNNs applied in the safety-critical grid applications need to be carefully considered. Various adversarial example algorithms have been proposed and shown effective in the field of computer vision, and the corresponding vulnerability analysis have been conducted in the safety-critical systems. So you may be wondering why we need to analyze the vulnerability in the DNN-based grid applications. In the left figures, adversarial stickers are pasted on the stop sign and successfully mislead the traffic sign recognition model to output the speed limit sign prediction. In the CB task similar to this example, the original clean inputs are static, so the attack can be computed and deployed in advance. These requirements of obtaining and modifying the clean original inputs are reasonable in the CV tasks. However, in smart grid, where the data is generated and analyzed dynamically, the requirements of real-time eavesdropping and data tampering for the attack construction is sometimes too stringent. Therefore, we cannot simply transfer the worry from the CV applications to the smart grid without discrimination, and the credibility analysis of the adversarial example attacks in the DNN-based grid application is needed. First, I'll briefly explain what are adversarial examples. The construction of adversarial examples can be formulated as this constraint optimization problem. The goal is to minimize the distance between the original sample and the adversarial sample, subject to that the output of the neural net is different from the original label. Here's a table of 6 representative adversarial example construction methods that are frequently evaluated in the literature. The first column tells the name of the attack. The second column tells whether the attack is input specific or universal. The former means the adversarial perturbation is effective against a particular clean example, and the latter means the perturbation is universal for many clean examples. The third column shows the computation needed for attack construction. One shot means only a single computation step using closed form formula is needed, and iterative means an iterative search process is applied during the attack construction. The last column shows the knowledge about the target model required by the attack construction. The white box methods require full knowledge about the DNN's internals, including its architecture and weights. And the black box only requires the access to run the model without knowing its internals. White or black box label means the attack is effective on the target model when constructed based on the target model's internals. And when these internals are not available, the attack can also be constructed based on a different surrogate model. This surrogate model may be trained by obtaining the training dataset or by querying the black box target model. And the goal of this work is to analyze the requirement and study the credibility of the adversarial attacks against the power grid-based DNN applications. In this work, we systematically investigate the requirements and discuss the credibility of the 6 representative adversarial attacks shown in the previous slide for a case study of the DNN-based online voltage stability assessment. And the stability assessment is based on this New England 10 machine 39 bus system. Specifically, we perform extensive offline time domain simulations to generate many voltage trajectories. And in each simulation, a 3-phase fault that lasts for a random duration is injected to a randomly selected bus. And the fault is cleared by a single or double transmission line stripping. Each sample consists 1 second long post-fault voltage trajectories of all the 39 buses and is labeled with stable or unstable. The figure on the right shows 2 examples of stable and unstable situation. We can see that after the fault clearance, in the stable situation, voltage of all the buses restore to an acceptable level. And in the unstable situation, the voltage levels remain far away from the nominal values. And we train a VSA DNN to look at the 1 second long voltage trajectories after the fault clearance and predict whether the voltage will be stable or unstable in the future. What follows, I will present how we analyze the credibility for each attack through our investigation experiments. The first step for the analysis is to find out the requirement for crafting each attack. According to our study, the requirements contain the read access and the write access to the clean voltage measurements, knowledge about the DNN's internal, and the knowledge about the DNN's training data. In the VSA case study, the number of buses that the attacker needs to tamper with is a key requirement. It indicates the difficulty to craft the attack. In this slide, I will introduce how we implement the partial adversarial perturbation to satisfy different intensity of write access requirement. Formulation for the partial perturbation construction is to minimize the distance between the original sample and the adversarial sample, subject to the output of the neural net is different from the original label, while only the input dimensions of X corresponding to the L buses to be attacked are modified. To implement such partial attack, we apply a mask M. M is a matrix that has unit values in the area corresponding to the L buses where the adversarial perturbations are added, and 0 values in the area where no perturbation is added. During the attack construction, the computed adversarial perturbation in each iteration is multiplied by M and add to each example. We implement this partial perturbation in our experiments. In this figure, the DNN accuracy under the white box attacks are presented. White box means the attacks are constructed based on the target VSA DNN's internals. Y-axis of this figure is the accuracy and x-axis is the number of attack bus L. First, let's look at the results under the input-specific attacks. When L ranges from 1 to 15, all attacks are not very effective. When L is 20, which means around 50% of all the bus voltage trajectories are attacked, the accuracy under FGSM and PGD attacks have significant drops. And when L is large enough, D4 and C and W attacks are both very effective. Although D4 and CW are considered very powerful in the field of computer vision, in the context of BSA, you need to tamper with too many bus. So this implies high attack overhead. For the universal attacks, when tampering with 20 and 25 bus voltage measurements, the UAN and UAP attacks become effective. Under the black box setting, the input-specific FGSM attack still can significantly decrease the DNN's accuracy when tampering with about half of the bus voltage readings. And other input-specific attacks are less effective as under the white box setting. This shows that FGSM is more transferable among all the considered input-specific attacks. This is because the FGSM attack underfits the surrogate DNN and has higher transferability to the target DNN, while the others overfit the surrogate DNN and therefore have reduced effectiveness against the target DNN. For the universal attacks, the UAN and UAP attacks achieve similar effectiveness as under the white box setting. This indicates that the universal attacks do not require the target DNN's internal to be effective. This also suggests that the two universal attacks are more transferable compared with the input-specific attacks. In this table, we summarize the attack effectiveness and the requirements against the VSA. The table presents the minimal set of requirements for each of the attack to render the attack effective. The first 4 rows are input-specific attacks, and the last 2 rows are universal attacks. All the input-specific attacks require read access to the original clean bus voltage trajectories to conduct attack, while the universal attacks do not. And all attack can be effective when only tampering with part of the bus voltage except for the C and W attack. In terms of the knowledge needed for the attack construction, the FGSM and the PGD attack only require DNN's internal under the white box setting or the training dataset under the black box setting. And this is marked by either in the table. For the D4 and CW attacks, the DNN's internal is a must for generating effective adversarial examples. And both UAP and UAN needs the training dataset to compute universal adversarial perturbation, and the DNN's internal is not a must. Now we understand the requirements to construct each of the attack. Next, I will discuss about the credibility of these requirements in detail. First, I will discuss the attack credibility in terms of the right access requirement. To launch both input-specific and universal attacks, the ability to tamper with the bus voltage traces is a must. And from the experiments, we observed that we only need to compromise about half of the buses to significantly increase the DNN's accuracy. And the cost increase when tampering with more buses, but attack effectiveness doesn't have much improvement. So obtaining the right access to compromise about half of the buses is a rule of thumb for the attacker. There are 3 possible ways to implement attacks. First is to hack into the enterprise network of the power grid control system. However, an attacker with such capability should directly subvert the VSA results instead of resorting to the adversarial example attack. The second way is to compromise the communication links from the buses to the control center. To launch such attack, On one hand, the attacker should be able to intercept the network transmission of the clean voltage trajectories on the communication path and transmit the maliciously perturbed voltage trajectory to the control center without causing any suspicion. On the other hand, the attacker should be able to breach the cryptographic protection of the communication link. The third way is to manipulate analog sensors, for example, by using remote electromagnetic inferences, and such capability have been demonstrated in the literature. And to summarize, the last two attack implementations are feasible and cannot be completely ignored, although they require sophisticated design and extensive skills. And in terms of the read-access requirement, for the input-specific attacks, the attacker needs to wait until the clean voltage is generated in order to compute the perturbation. Therefore, the sensor manipulation is not applicable, and the attacker must inject the attack through the communication links from buses to the control center, which needs sophisticated design and is less credible. And the construction of the universal attacks is independent of the real-time clean voltage trajectories. So the attacker can launch the attack either by manipulating the sensor readings or compromising the communication link. So universal attacks are more credible. The static knowledge needed by the attack construction includes the target model's DNN, the training data, or the black box DNN. From our experiments, at least one of them is needed to construct effective adversarial examples. And because these information are static, they can be obtained in the scenario of the advanced persistent threat. For example, the attacker may use social engineering against the employees of a grid operator to obtain this static information. So preserving the confidentiality of the static knowledge of the power system is a weak defense. And during our study, we found that the universal adversarial example has the same credibility as the widely studied false data injection attack against the power grid state estimation. This is the formulation for the FDI attack vector. Here, A is the FDI attack vector, and H is a constant matrix for the state estimation, which is determined by the power grid. And C is an arbitrary vector. From this formulation, the attack is computed independently from the real-time power flow. So for the universal adversarial example, it also needs a static training dataset, which is similar to H. And the construction of the universal attack is independent of the real-time system measurements. So the universal adversarial example attack has the same credibility as the FDI attack. In the following part of this presentation, I'll present how the 6 adversarial attacks perform under different defenses. In this work, we employed adversarial training and the APE as defense methods and evaluate their effectiveness in the VSA DNN. Adversarial training is a model hardening defense that attempts to improve model robustness by including adversarial example with their correct labels into the training dataset for model training. In the paper, we include the PGD adversarial examples during the adversarial training. Existing studies and competition results have shown that PGD adversarial training gives state-of-the-art performance on various benchmarks. And APE again is an input cleansing defense that trains a generator to cleanse the input adversarial example, and outputs its benign counterpart. The generator is trained under the GAN setting. We also try to combine these two defenses. Our experiment result shows that the adversarial training has best defense performance. So in the following presentation, I will only show the defense performance of the adversarial training. This figure shows the DNN's accuracy under the white box attacks with PGD adversarial training. We can see that for almost all of the attacks, the adversarial training is very effective in protecting the VSA DNN, except for the less credible deep fall attack. The dashed line here represents the deep fall result with no defense, and we can see that the accuracy is improved with the adversarial training. Under the black box setting, all attacks are not effective against the adversarially trained DNN. And for the more credible universal UAP and UAN attacks, under both white box and black box settings, the adversarial training can effectively protect target VSA DNNs. And this is the conclusions for this paper. And this is all of my presentations today. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Xiong. Now I suppose we'll go over to question time. We have approximately 7 minutes, so feel free. Yeah, wonderful presentation. Thanks, Dominique. So hands up for questions, or feel free to post them in the chat. And I see we've got a couple of hands up already, which is fantastic. So maybe over to Anna, who I can see first with her hands up.
So, good afternoon. Thanks for the great talk. It was very interesting, very insightful presentation. I had, however, might miss some important point here. You have set up 6 attack scenarios and you extracted 4 requirements. Does these attack scenarios and these requirements cover all the threat landscape, or why you have selected these particular ones? Is there more or there are less? Are they the most important ones? Could you elaborate on this a little bit?
Do you mean why I choose these 6 attacks?
Exactly, yeah. Are they enough?
Yeah. The 6 attacks is chosen based on a few survey. I've been working on adversarial example for about 3 years, so I think these 6 attacks covers almost all the attack categories. And other attacks, there might be other attacks, but the variance is minimal. And I think they can all belong to these 6 categories in terms of the algorithms for the construction.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. And so next we have Dominique.
Yep, thank you for the talk. I have a question. So you chose a subset of buses where you do an adversary attack on. So my question is, does it make a difference on what subset I choose? So what buses from the network I choose to have a different effect on the attack? Or is it more or less similar depending on the subset I choose?
Actually, during the attack construction, I didn't consider the relationship between the buses I choose. But I believe if we need to follow some rule for a specific power grid, I think we can, it's also feasible because the algorithm for choosing the bus can be adjusted.
Because I would expect that from a power system perspective, there might be some buses that have a higher influence on your scenario that you consider, which mean they have a higher, they're kind of vulnerable, more vulnerable to attacks if you kind of can forge the voltage measurements from that buses. So they might have a higher impact to the overall problem. Just a guess. So that's something probably for future work.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'm just going to have a quick check. I don't see anyone else with their hand raised, but feel free to unmute yourself if I've missed you, or feel free to post a chat. We've got still a few more minutes for questions, and maybe while you're thinking of them, just one that sort of came to mind when I was listening to your talk, Cheng, is like what are potential ways, I suppose, that we might be able to identify these attacks? For example, false data injection attacks, we might have a separate state operator. Synchrophases have been considered as one way to test and verify the states or observers or things like this. Like, I don't know if you've thought, like, what is the best way we can potentially protect our grid, I suppose, from these kinds of attacks? One, in terms of observing them, and two, in terms of mitigating them.
Yeah, I think
Big
this
question.
is an open question, because in the field of computer vision, this attack defense game is still running. So there's new defense and new attacks coming out every day. So I think if we need to apply machine learning to the smart grid applications, we need to closely follow the state-of-the-art attacks or defense in the field of computer vision. And also, we need to consider the practical situation in smart grid, like whether these attacks are credible and whether they can be deployed in the real system. Yeah.
Great, thanks. I know we've got a few more minutes up our sleeves, so maybe just a quick follow-up. Usually, like when we've seen these kinds of attacks happen in practice, usually the actors have been in the system for a considerable amount of time, right, in the order of 7 to 12 months or maybe even longer. And usually they're looking for like ways to infiltrate and test, but without the lights going off, right? It's pretty easy to see if you open a circuit breaker that supplies power that someone's like hacked your system, right? So have you thought about stealthy ways, I suppose, to do an attack that you could be undetected? Like, are there some of these attack vectors that lend themselves better to stealthy attack, or is that just knowing the power system and the grid itself?
Yeah, that's actually one of my future direction I like to look into to find out a more stealthy way, or like considering some constraints in the power system. Yeah.
Oh, interesting, fantastic. Yeah, look forward to following your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So if there's any further questions, we've just got a couple of minutes. Otherwise, we might move to our next guest speaker. But a big thank you, Chung. That was a really great presentation. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.